Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everyone here to this great occasion. I'm Gray Krause, Director of the Emeritus College, and this is one of our signature events of the year, and the Sheth Distinguished Lecture for the Creativity in Later Life. There are a number of people I want to thank, but first and foremost are Jag and Madhu Sheth, who have generously underwritten the lecture series, which began in 2004. So thank you very much to the Sheths right here. I also want to thank one of our members, Beverly Schaefer, who first suggested Dennis Lockhart as a speaker, and then our Mind Matters Committee, who selected the speaker for this year, co-chaired by Gretchen Schultz and Holly York, and of course the Emeritus College Administrative Assistant, Diane Becht, who's spent many months working on this event. I also want to thank the Emory Alumni Association, who are helping to sponsor this event and letting us use this really magnificent space. So our speaker today, in several senses, I think needs no introduction. I think probably almost all of you have seen the information that I've sent out in the newsletter about Dennis Lockhart. I will just say a few words to remind everyone. He received his bachelor's in political science and economics from Stanford University, and then a master's in international economics and American foreign policy from Johns Hopkins, and then spent 17 years with Citicorp Citibank, working both in the US and abroad in Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Greece, and Iran, and then moved to Heller Financial in Zephyr, and then came to Atlanta in 2007, where he became the 14th president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank, and he just retired in February. So, probably it's not necessary to remind anyone in this room that the last 10 years in the US economy have been, one could say, interesting. So that was quite a time to be part of the Federal Reserve Bank. And he served, he was responsible for all of the bank's activities in the 6th Federal Reserve District, which covers Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, and parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and activities involving monetary policy, bank supervision and regulation, and payment services. He also served on the Federal Reserve Chief Monetary Policy Body, the Federal Open Market Committee. So it's really a great pleasure to welcome Dennis here today.
Thank you, Greg. Well, Greg, thank you very much for that introduction. You know, when I retired, I thought maybe I wouldn't have to listen to that again, you know, responsible for all the bank's activities and on the Open Market Committee and so forth, but no such luck. It's a pleasure being here for the Sheth annual lecture. I want to thank Jag, whom I've known for quite some time. We've served on the World Affairs Council board together and had a lot of contact over the years, and Madhu as well. Thank you for your generosity to make this happen. As Gray said, I retired at the end of February, and so I am going through what I understand many in the room have gone through. You know, when you're a Fed president, you have license to go out and talk about, at least about the economy and about monetary policy. And so I got used to that. And I had a boss once who said when he retired that he went from who's who to who's that in 6 months. And that's probably the process I'm going through. And I've only been at this thing called retirement, or at least official retirement, for a few weeks now. So I hope I'll get some sympathy from you. It's a little bit scary when you step off, get out of the routine that you're so used to, and the structure you're so used to. One of my learnings in the first 5 or 6 weeks is it wasn't me who was organized, it was my assistant who was organized for all those years. And so I've been juggling things and forgetting meetings and not making reservations and things like that. So this is a real process. Now, the lecture is set up, as I understand it, to focus on the question of creativity in later years. You know, I'm not convinced that's such a big issue. There was an article in the New York Times just a few weeks ago, and it said, you know, to be creative in your old age, think like a 94-year-old, and it went on to talk about a professor of physics named Goodenough, who at age 94, he and his team filed for a patent. And it's a patent on, I believe, on battery technology. And the article showed a bell-shaped curve of patent awards in the last few years. I think it's 2011 through 2014, and the majority of patents were awarded to people over the age of 45, between 45 and 60. And if you add 61 to 65 and 66 to 70, it was a clear majority. And it was very much a bell-shaped curve. That is, the older people looked like the cohort 21 to 26. So I'm not at all convinced that creativity is a challenge, but I do know that kind of reconstructing your life after you've gotten out of your main career is something of a challenge. And I read a book recently called The Portfolio Life. And like so many of these books, there's one simple idea and then 250 pages of stories about individuals and so forth. But the simple idea is, after a certain stage in life, it makes a great deal of sense to put together a portfolio of things. And that is what I am doing. So today I will probably meet your expectations by talking a little bit about the economy and reflecting on my experience in the Federal Reserve and on the Federal Open Market Committee. But then I will end up by telling you some of the new things that I'm involved in and interested in, and how I'm sort of connecting them, at least in my own feeble mind, to be a coherent set of activities that feed off of each other. We'll see about that, but that's the basic idea. So I want to take a look back at this last decade, and I know it sounds really self-celebratory or self-indulgent, but I think historians will really see this period from 2007 to 2017 or end of 2016 as a distinct economic period. It happens to coincide with the time I was in office. The bookends of that period, 2007 was the financial crisis beginning, and I'll argue that the end of that 10-year period amounts to a substantial recovery, a cyclical recovery in the economy. A lot of people want to say the economy is back to normal. I don't buy that really, and I get very cautious about using the word normal. Economies evolve, economies change, they undergo structural change over time. We're not going back to something that pre-existed. We are in a new economy, or an economy that evolved out of the events of the last 10 years. So it began with crisis. There are really four plots to the story of the last 10 years. And that crisis began in July of 2007. I remember it very vividly because when I took the job as president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and honest to God, I thought this is going to be an easy job. Economy is sailing along. I'm going to go to a few meetings, make a few speeches. This will be a nice capstone. It will not be too taxing. And within a year or so, I was going to physical therapy to get rid of some of the kinks that I developed from tension as part of the group that was having to deal with the crisis. So you remember some of the details. We had bank bailouts, one insurance company bailout, a lot of capital that was forced upon banks to recapitalize the banking system. And understandably, all those actions gave rise to a lot of outrage, political and public outrage, because it was effectively taxpayer money that was being used to bail out entities that had been overexposed and gotten in trouble. And the centerpiece of that were the institutions that were called systemically important. And the rationale of all the emergency efforts that the Federal Reserve undertook was that the system was at risk, and that what had developed between July of 2007 and late 2008 was something that was contagious, it was global, and it had the potential of melting down the financial system of the world. The crisis gave rise to the world's, to the deepest recession we've had in the post-war period. And Grave mentioned some of my background of living abroad, and I had a little bit of a track record that some people saw cause and effect. I was evacuated from Lebanon during the Civil War. I was in Iran and left during a revolution, moved to Atlanta for the first time. I happened to be in New York on 9/11, and then I joined the Federal Reserve and ushered in the world's worst financial crisis and recession in decades. But what economists will tell you, Jeff Rosenzweig here will tell you, correlation does not equal causation. You know, many of you in the room are scientists, so you know that from background. If I were to put in terms of a kind of a picture what the story of the last 10 years looks like, that's what happened when I arrived. So you can see where the accusation comes from that I had something to do with it. And that is maybe the end of the story. It's been a long, slow recovery. Now, Jeff, for example, from the business school, who's an economist, looks at that and said, it's not that smooth. And all of you who've dealt with statistics and data know, no, it's not that smooth. It's a sawtooth kind of thing. This is highly simplified, but it is basically that story. But when you're in the middle of it and you're dealing with whether it's a crisis or a recession, and you get a down month or a down quarter in something, you don't know if the world isn't falling apart from there, or if you get an up quarter, you don't know if it's sustainable or going to be persistent. So even though it looks like a smooth and easy to explain story, in fact, as one lived it, it was really a very ragged story, and one that had a lot of twists and turns and aspects that were, at the time, pretty scary, difficult to make a good assessment of where we were. So the first part of the story of the last 10 years is a cyclical recovery, and let me back that up. Our national economy is at about 112 or 113% of what it was in 2007. So we have recovered all the ground that was lost during the recession and more. So we've made a full comeback. Another way to look at it is employment. That employment became obviously a very serious concern of policymakers and of the country. Unemployment spiked at 10% using the conventional way of measuring unemployment, and is at 4.5%. I joined in March of 2007, joined the Fed, and at that time the unemployment rate was 4.5%. So it's come full circle. But during the crisis and recession, and even a little bit post-recession, the economy lost 8.5 million jobs were destroyed. And since the trough, the country has created about 15 or 15.5 million jobs. So we're 7 million jobs better off than we were. If you look at house prices, house prices or houses are the asset that is most important to many families. And a lot of people gauge their wealth from the value of their house. Well, there was a substantial loss in house prices, and all of that has been recovered and more. So there are a number of things that I think argue for the upper left-hand corner that we've seen a cyclical recovery and a return to something that is better, if not a return to normal. The policy response, when we were entering and going down that roller coaster, was really quite remarkable. And historians will focus a lot on that policy response. When I started in March of 2007, the policy rate, the technical term is the federal funds rate, but the rate that the Federal Reserve tries to influence that then has an effect on all other interest rates, was at 5.25%. By December of 2008, a year and 3/4 afterwards, it was at 0. And for me, the most memorable part of that story of really cratering interest rates was Martin Luther King weekend in January of 2008. The chair of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, who is a South Carolinian from a small town in South Carolina, for what it's worth, one of us, you might say, he called a secret meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee. It's secret until it's announced that there was a meeting. So it's not secret for long, but at the time it was going on, no one knew it was going on. It was a Sunday afternoon. It was a teleconference. And he proposed dropping the interest rate, the policy rate, by 3/4%. And those of you who follow financial affairs and the Federal Reserve know that we don't operate in increments of 3/4%. We operate with 1/4% move almost religiously. So to go 3/4% was a big deal. The other thing interesting about the meeting, and this is sort of a little, I guess just a little anecdote about how the world works. We had that meeting on Sunday afternoon, and we had to end by 4 o'clock because of the Asia opening in Tokyo. That is to say, something that was going to affect the US dollar interest rate structure was going to influence markets in Tokyo, and the news had to be posted before the market opened in Tokyo. So it's just, I hadn't thought about it, quite frankly, when I went into these secret meetings, but I got used to it. We had several meetings on Sunday that had that deadline. We got to make a decision before the Asia opening. Well, when you drop interest rates as low as they can go, what economists call the zero bound or the zero lower bound. And in theory, although the theory is being tested now around the world, but in theory, you cannot take the policy rate below 0, and you still want to give stimulus to the economy. What do? Well, there is a very technical jargon term called quantitative easing, and the way it works is pretty simple. The central bank does what only a central bank can do, and that is create money out of nothing. Poof. Just create money. Then use that money to buy securities. and to buy longer maturity securities, and all that buying on Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities put pressure on those long-term rates. And the idea was to have that translate into keeping mortgage rates low to support the housing market, keeping auto rates low to support the automobile industry, keeping business longer-term rates low just to support investment. It was all meant to add stimulus to an economy that was really, at the time, really in the dumps and ailing. And so we went through 3 rounds of quantitative easing throughout that whole period. The policy rate remained at absolute zero, or close to zero. And as a consequence of that, the balance sheet of the central bank ballooned. When I joined in March of '07, it was about $900 billion. Now it's $4.5 trillion, so a quintupling. You know, most of you maybe don't have a lot of background in this world. I'll make the argument that if you want to kind of find the absolute epicenter of a commercial and financial structure, you go to and look at the balance sheet of the central bank. In a way, that's where it all starts. That's where money comes from, money in circulation, and in this case, money that remained parked on the balance sheet of the central bank. So we went through what amounted to several years of extraordinary policy. This was really strong medicine for the economy. And only in December of 2015, did we raise interest rates for the first time. So the policy rate remained at zero for about 6 years, a little more than 6 years, approaching 7 years. And there had that was the first move upward in over a decade. So, you know, just a long, long period of low interest rates. I don't think that's the whole story. Cyclical recovery and policy response that sort of nurtured that recovery. At the same time, there were some secular trends, and let me define secular trends, at least in the world of economics and central banking. I'll define secular trend as a persistent trend that seems to be impervious to monetary stimulus. Something seems to be going on that monetary policy can't change. These are trends that may have begun well before the crisis, and they may persist for a long time. So I'll give you a couple of important examples. First, in employment. Whereas gross domestic product, the total output of the economy, started high, went low, and came back. And as I said, is at 112, 113% of where it was in 2007. So the economy has come back. Labor force participation through that period continued to decline. Employment has come back. Labor force participation declined. There are arguments about what are the reasons for that, but one reason is pure demographics. It's our generation, baby boomers, entering retirement, the retirement period of life. My staff at the Atlanta Fed, before I left, did some scenarios on labor force participation. And in no scenario could my staff see anything but a resumption in the decline of labor force participation. It's been a bit stabilized for the last couple of years as we've had such a good period of employment growth, but in no scenario did they not see it continuing to decline. The big story of the coming decade or two is simply the baby boom generation reaching retirement age. And even though there will be growth of millennials in that generation, growth of prime age workers in the economy, the major story still is baby boomers reaching retirement. Another secular trend is the weakness in productivity growth. And this one is a head scratcher, really, including some very smart economists who have looked at it. There's a professor at Northwestern by the name of Robert Gordon. He's a senior economist, been around for a long time. He's written extensively recently on the subject of productivity growth. And he argues, you can test this against your own intuition, he argues that there is no technology on the horizon that is the equivalent in terms of productivity impact of electricity in its time, or the computer in its time, or maybe the internet. I'm sort of holding judgment on this one because I look at digitization, I look at artificial intelligence, I look at robotics and automation. It's certainly getting a lot of play today in the press, and it's certainly on the minds of people what automation and robotics will do to the employment picture in the country. But I think it's a fascinating question of whether any of that will be big enough to have the impact on productivity that electricity had when we went from being without electricity to having electricity. So that's his argument. There is another secular trend, or what looked like a secular trend at work, and that is weak business investment. For whatever reason, the business community was investing only for replacement or for maintenance, or maybe to eke out productivity and eliminate a job, but not investing as a bet on the future, not investing for a robust growth story, but investing what you had to invest. And that gave rise to several years. Only in recent quarters have we seen a little bit of improvement of weak business investment. That is associated with a productivity idea called capital deepening, the deepening of the capital base of your economy. And my staff at the Atlanta Fed was more convinced that that was influencing productivity growth than perhaps the technology question. The secular trends, I could name several more, but a number of the secular trends, particularly related to employment, business formation, so forth, are associated with demographics. And there is a demographic explanation of what's going on. Now, Jeff here is a credentialed economist. I sort of earned my stripes by doing the job. Jeff, I would argue that demographic influences are underappreciated in the economics profession as an underlying cause of what's happening.
If I could advertise, I think you, when you were president of the Atlanta Fed, started studying this. I think some of this is available, right, on the website for people to keep up with. And would you say your studies in general show about maybe half of the
Participation
is really due to demographics? People in this room, myself,
yeah. I'm going to talk in a second about some other ways I think that demographics are going to influence the economy. The fourth subplot is headwinds. And again, I'll define my terms here. A headwind is a temporary development of some kind that suppresses economic activity for a period of time. And here are some examples. The decline of Chinese growth. We had a couple of fiscal near misses where we remember the fiscal cliff that was being publicized a few years ago, and something that's has to happen before the end of April. A couple of default scares that gave the business community the willies, and everybody backed off hiring or investing. The volatility of the oil price, the Greek debt saga in Europe, weakness in Europe in general, the banking system weakness. Last year, it was Brexit and the election. Think of these headwinds as excuses for not doing anything, basically, for not hiring someone or for not making an investment, and for basically just getting very cautious. One of my staff members went back and looked at 35 quarters since the economy came out of recession, and in 30 of the 35, there was a headwind in the news in some way that had the tendency to just make people a little bit more cautious. So that added to it. Now, I don't know how to deal with that. Is that just the reality of our current world? I tend to think if you are sort of on the knife's edge of making important decisions on personnel or on investment, in today's world, you are influenced by the news, and if the news is scary, a face-off with North Korea, you know, it's prudent not to pull the trigger. Just wait a little while, see if things clear up. And if it's one of those things after another, it just has an effect of slowing down the economy. So that's my explanation of what we have been through for the last 10 years. It's not as simple as saying we've had a cyclical recovery, which we've had, but there were other things at work. And as a consequence of that, here's productivity growth and real GDP. As a consequence of that, economists have progressively downgraded their sense. I understand there are a number of people here who were in the medical profession, their sense of the metabolic rate of the economy. And what this shows is estimates of long-run potential growth of the economy by year, and each year, and I attribute this partly to experience and partly to, of course, deep scholarly analysis of the question, but for whatever reason, that downgrade has taken place. And as a consequence, the economists' forecasts of the economy going forward have been progressively downgraded. And very importantly, and this is a little bit more inside baseball stuff, the estimate of the equilibrium policy interest rate, where the Federal Reserve would stop in a progression of rate increases. The estimate of that stopping point has been downgraded. Put numbers on it. 2 years ago, I was saying 4%. When I was leaving the Fed, I was saying 3%. A substantial indicator of what I like to call the metabolic rate of the economy being lower. All right, why is this all important? Well, partly because the political world is talking about 4% growth, 3.5% to 4% growth. And so it is a very front and center question, and believe me, whether we're in retirement or not, it's important to everyone in the room how fast the economy grows on a sustainable basis with inflation under control. And the position I take on that question is I think the economy can continue to grow at a moderate pace of around 2%, but I am skeptical at this point of the ability for the economy to grow at 3.5% to 4% on a sustainable basis, which is another way of saying much of what you have been hearing, I'm going to say in this room, may be pie in the sky. And the two underlying reasons are demographic and productivity growth. And it will be a heavy lift for some of the proposed policies on the fiscal side to overcome the drag of demographic effects on the economy. And I'm simply agnostic on the question of whether we're going to see a spurt in productivity growth. So I remain to be convinced that that's coming because of technology or even a reversal of business investment. So let me turn to a few comments on what I'm putting into my portfolio life, which are building on the experience I've had, and at least one of them I think you'll find very interesting. I am chairing the advisory council of the Emory Brain Health Center. I am a layman, obviously, as a neurologist. I am learning whatever I can as I go along, but I was asked by Alan Levy and Mark Rappaport if I would chair that, and Jeff Rosenzweig is on that, in that group as well. And this is a group of substantially lay people. Bill Fagey is in the group, and who else?
Helen Mayberg, who's maybe done the most interesting work on depression in the world, and also Mullen DeLong, who's the world's expert.
Well, they're not part of the advisory council. They're being advised by supposedly by the advisory council.
But it shows the quality of every people involved.
So we put this together and to support the Brain Health Center. If you haven't been over to Executive Park to see the Brain Health Center, it's really quite an impressive installation. And as many of you know better than I do, neurology is just exploding as a field. Well, understandably, I kind of approach it from an economics point of view. What does all this mean for the economy? And the question is, what influence will the increasing incidence of neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, and so forth, have on the economy over time? And I don't know quite how to quantify this, but I have some concerns. These are diseases that express themselves with longevity. People are living longer. If you get to age 85, you have about a 33% chance of having Alzheimer's or being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And the standard of care today is full-time monitoring by a caregiver or a family member or someone. And unless we find a cure or a treatment that slows the progression of these diseases, excuse me, I think inevitably it's going to fall to families to take care of people with Alzheimer's, or particularly Alzheimer's. And that will fall disproportionately on women who may be leaving the workforce, somewhat involuntarily, but leaving the workforce in order to care for a family member. Now, the magnitude of that in the overall scheme of things probably won't be a game changer, but it's simply one more thing that falls out of my focus on demographics as having a meaningful influence on the economy. The second thing I'm beginning to work on is infrastructure, infrastructure policy. And one reason I was attracted to looking at the infrastructure question is because it is truly bipartisan. Actually, both Republicans and Democrats are for this thing, but no one can explain to me in any detail what renewal of the country's infrastructure really amounts to. We've heard a number, $1 trillion over 10 years, but I haven't heard really much in the way of, pardon the pun, concrete information about infrastructure and what it's really going to be, what the priorities should be, and whether it's possible to invest in productivity-enhancing infrastructure. So that's a very important question. And if I were to go back and talk a little bit about the productivity question, there's another aspect of productivity growth, and that is what economists call labor quality. And so the third thing that I'm spending some of my time in my portfolio of activities is an initiative here in Atlanta called Learn for Life. And Learn for Life is a community engagement model that was started in Cincinnati and now is being used in over 60 cities in the United States. And basically what it amounts to is making public education decisions according to what the data tell you. So data are being collected at 6 points in a person's life: kindergarten readiness, 3rd grade reading, 8th grade math, graduation from high school, entry into post-secondary education in some form, and then getting a job. And we have now a small team working with all the school districts, 7 school districts, I believe, to get uniformity of data collection so that in coming years, in public education, the community, people who want to help and want to see that money is well spent, will be able to really target where the problems really are. And I don't want to be too apocalyptic, but we don't have a lot more chances of fixing public education. So this strikes me as a sensible thing to do, and it's obviously very important for labor quality in a world that is going to be quite different in the coming decades. So I will end there. Jag, Murthu, thank you so much for sponsoring this. And since we're all going through the same thing here, this getting used to retirement, feel free to make comments as well as any questions for a couple minutes. Okay.
Hi, my name is Don Stein, and I'm a professor in the School of Medicine here at Emory. One of the things that I didn't hear you speak about, and that most people don't speak about in these long-term projections, and I would really like to know if I'm wrong on this, but it seems to me that we've been in a wartime economy since literally I've been born, which was in 1939. And nobody seems to know, whether it's politicians or economists, nobody seems to address the never-ending increases in spending. And I'm not making a political statement here, but it's a fact of life that military spending eats up a huge proportion of our budget, almost as much as health care. So how do you factor in this, and where does it end, and how do we address the issues of infrastructure spending, dealing with health care issues, dealing with research that will improve all the various aspects of life, whether it's research on infrastructure development, transportation, or health? And it seems to me this is a blind spot for everybody that no one is willing to address in dealing with the long-term strategies and priorities of this country if we're to survive.
Well, I share your view. We spend more in defense than the next 10 countries. You know, we are the world's defense bulwark, and project that power around the world in ways that are expensive, and have been the leaders, not the sole parties, but leaders of interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen and quite a number of other places. Is that going to change? I mean, I always try to keep my feet on the ground. I'm not sure I see that changing in any dramatic way, that we're going to continue to be simply a big defense spender as a federal budget, and that means a big defense economy as well.
But if I could just follow up, if that's true, and you're projecting all these decreases in jobs and training and so on and so forth, how do you address it?
Well, you're absolutely right. You're right about pointing to the problem. And this is something, as I study infrastructure, I'm going to try to understand. Here's the problem as I see it now, and understand, I'm just starting out here. Most infrastructure are public goods. The public sector provides them, and then they are free. And the alternative to that is public-private partnerships, which is turning a road into a business, or a bridge, or or some other form of infrastructure, where you get tolling of some kind or you build a revenue stream and so forth. The record of public-private partnerships in the United States is not very good. They have not been all that successful, and there have not been very many of them. So some of the thinking in the infrastructure world is that we have to find a way to mobilize private capital to do the necessary spending. And I'm not convinced at this stage that I can see how you get there exactly. Maybe technology can have a big positive impact in the sense of putting into automobiles electronic technology that can gauge usage of particular public assets and simply send you a bill, much like Easy Pass or something like that. I was down in Miami, and we actually sponsored a Cornell professor who is an expert on public-private partnerships, and he said, yeah, we can put these things in cars, and they can follow where you are driving and therefore charge you for the use of roads. Somebody in the audience said, here in Miami, in 1 week, there would be a whole industry to take that thing off your car. So there are just a lot of unanswered questions, and you put your finger on the right thing. Can we afford infrastructure renewal? Or, and maybe one of those questions you have to turn it around. Can we afford not to find a way to do it? I mean, how many of you have flown into LaGuardia recently? You know, or versus flying into 50 what we would consider to be third world airports, you know.
Listen, thank you very much for a good talk. Appreciate it. Let me ask you a sort of moral question, a Bernie Sanders kind of question, fitting into this sort of thing. I can just take off from the last thing you said. You know, we can't do infrastructure because you can't get private companies to really get into it. How about the government? In other words, let me just go back to this. Single payer, how monstrous hard that is for us to even contemplate.
Is that on?
Oh, hey, listen.
But Dennis, you can just repeat.
Hello, is that better?
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have pushed the button. Okay, I was going to ask something of a Bernie Sanders type question against all this. Not against it, but I mean in context of all this. You talked about demographics quite a bit. Well, there's a huge demographic in America that's very poor, uneducated, not fed well. Millions and millions of people, little kids, you know, who lose out between their first and fifth year and catching up with anybody. All that. Now, how can you make what you're talking about count for these millions of Americans in the lower classes you know, I don't expect you to have a pretty perfect answer to it. I just want to get their presence into your conversation. Otherwise, it's all numbers among.
Well, let me use your question to make a point without giving you a solution, because the solutions are extremely elusive. But this is why growth is so important. And growth defined as the rate of expansion of the economy consistent with low and stable inflation. You can have high growth and high inflation, but consistent with low and stable inflation. Why it is so desirable to get, if you can, to get to that 3 to 4% range, because 3% is 50% better than 2% growth. I'm arguing that the realistic view is 2% for the next few years, but why it's so important to make efforts to try to get there. Government revenues rise with GDP growth. It allows us to afford things that need to be done that cannot be afforded in a lower growth economy. And I am not giving you an optimistic view of that question.
Just a quick follow-up, though. The need for growth. But it's growth to whom? To what corporations? to what super rich of the 2% who can't get enough? They're just pouring it in, the families, so on.
The comment is growth for whom? And it is Gene. He rightfully pointed to the inequality issues that have been worsening. That's another secular trend. I could have put that on the list of secular trends that have been going on for many years now and getting worse. Growth does at least provide employment, and we've stabilized that part of the picture. Apparently, most people who want a job have a job. Some of them are involuntarily working part-time, but they have jobs. With a stronger growth economy, we would get higher paying jobs. I mull this over. I think the solutions at either extreme to the inequality question are very horrifying. One is a completely redistributive state, which many quarters will fight tooth and nail, and the other is people marching in the streets and and creating essentially Vietnam era type of resistance. And those of you invested in the stock market, the market will tank if they see either of those coming. So it is a kind of a delicate balance that has to be maintained while we try to do something about those problems. I don't have easy answers. Yes, ma'am. Microphone right behind you.
Two drags that come to mind. One, in terms of healthcare, our healthcare with multiple payers is more expensive than any single payer system in the world. What can we do to reverse that so that we come into a first world healthcare system that is better, that reaches those kids and reaches the 50 and 60-year-olds, and at the same time doesn't bankrupt the government? I mean, there are structural changes that need to happen, and I don't see them down the road at all. The other is something that I've just bumped into recently in terms of growth and employment, and that is for people who are in middle ranges of income. Once they hit 50, 55 as the top, more and more people are fired so that the company can hire somebody younger to do the same work and not risk lawsuits for age discrimination. So there are micro headwinds within the economy that need to come to the forefront.
On the latter question, I got one here. On the latter question, I have not seen widespread evidence of willful firing of older people to replace them with younger people. More often what I believe has occurred is some regret that people are retiring because they're very productive and they're higher paid, but they're very productive. But you are correct in pointing out that whether that's happening because of what you would call malfeasance or it's happening just by natural processes, what it has a tendency to do is suppress wage data. And some good economists at the San Francisco Federal Reserve looked into this, and their conclusion was some of the numbers that we use to gauge how things are developing are influenced by this phenomenon of older people retiring, and they were highly paid. They had built up a salary over years, being replaced by less productive and lower paid people. And then they do the surveys, and it looks like wages are not moving at all when it's that effect. On the question of single payer, this is very much a political question. My personal view is we will keep experimenting until we finally get around to Medicare for all. But that could take years because of basically ideological battles, and so I think that's it. Will they'll if they are able to replace the Affordable Care Act, it will fail for a variety of reasons, and we'll keep doing that until finally there is enough political pressure to get Medicare for all.
In terms of long-term potential growth, what effect is this growing gig economy going to have on the overall economy of the United States?
I'll repeat the question. The question is, in terms of long-term growth, what effect will the so-called gig economy have? Well, it is a form of employment. Yeah. And it's very interesting how employment data, let me even step back further. The central bank, the Federal Reserve, and its committee, the Federal Open Market Committee, sets monetary policy with two statutory objectives: full employment and low and stable prices. You can debate what full employment looks like, but we're close to full employment. How do you get that number that tells you it's at 4.5%? The Bureau of Labor Statistics calls up, I forget the number, but thousands of people every month, and they ask, are you employed? People in the gig economy are likely to answer that question, yes. Some may say no, but I'm going to say that as it becomes more and more established as a form of work, a legitimate way of being in the labor market, they will say, yes, I drive for Lyft, or I drive for Uber or whatever. So it simply is a shift in how people are employed in the economy, not necessarily a spur to growth nor a detraction from growth. It's just a different way of employing people.
Okay. Dennis, I would like to ask questions which are less serious, I guess. One, does Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta holds gold or not?
Hold gold?
Yes.
Well, I was there 10 years and I never saw any gold.
Okay,
There is gold at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
Yes, I know that.
But not
here.
Not
Okay.
in Atlanta.
In the vault, right. The second question is that when are you going to finish your autobiography?
I'm not, I like to look forward. I don't want to look back.
It'll be very
I
interesting.
didn't take notes through this period, so a lot that I described. Ben Bernanke wrote a marvelous book on this period. I would recommend that book. Don't wait for mine.
I would recommend write one because each one has a different story, different perspectives. It's absolutely fascinating what you just told us right now, your perspective on this whole thing. But writing some sort of your own personal journey would be very inspiring to other people.
Just a very small question. What do you think Trump is going to do for our economy? Is it going to be a bull market of bull?
What's that again? I'm sorry.
Trump's economy. How is it going to shape the country?
The what economy? Yeah, well, I spent 10 years being scrupulously non-political, and I haven't unlearned those lessons yet. But I did say that, and many economists, I think, agree with this position, that we look skeptically, or at least very cautiously, at the promises of much higher growth.
Yeah, but what if the country gets into this kind of war, right? We just went to Afghanistan.
Well, here is a bit, probably a little bit too much information on that question, but this is something that's worth mentioning. economists have a concept called shocks, economic shocks. Actually, many of the recessions of the last 30 years have been associated with a rapid change in the oil price. So oil price spikes, boom, recession. So an oil price crisis of some kind is a shock. And I mentioned a number of headwinds that were political events around the world, or political and sometimes economic events. But interestingly, our economy, once it builds some reasonable momentum, just plows through some of things we thought were going to be shocks. In June of last year, we had a meeting in Washington. It was 2 weeks before the Brexit vote. There was serious discussion of moving up the policy rate. And the consensus was, well, we're 2 weeks away from this thing. Why would we take a chance now that there's something bad happens? The something bad did happen. I would say generally the feeling was that they should stay. And it has very little effect on the U.S. economy. So if you take something even as radical as a Bay of Pigs style, or not Bay of Pigs, but Cuban Missile Crisis style face-off, I dare say the U.S. economy would ignore it. It'd have a few days effect, and then the economy would plow on. So some of the stuff that worries us so much from economic point of view is a transitory kind of influence on the economy. And our economy right now has quite decent momentum.
So you ended your Federal Reserve story with interest rates being at all-time low and $4 trillion on your budget. As all this gets unwound, what's going to happen? What's your looking forward? The Federal Reserve is in a place it's never been before. What's going to happen?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, the large balance sheet is now being addressed as a policy issue, and probably the beginning of unwinding will start this year. Toward the end of the year is my guess. And it will start by simply allowing securities to mature. So you have to wrap your head around what happens when a security is owned by the central bank and it matures. We get the money back and we destroy it, or they destroy it. Just the way they created it, poof, and bought the securities, it's just the opposite. And the balance sheet shrinks, and that money, so to speak, monetary base money, declines. That will not be pursued if the economic context isn't pretty favorable for doing that. In other words, the Federal Reserve would not consciously pursue that objective at the expense of the economy, only if the economic environment were supportive of that. So that the answer to your question, what will happen, is if it's done right, nothing, or at least nothing very obvious will happen. There's always a chance of making a policy mistake, and the history of Federal Reserve is lots of policy mistakes over the years. So this is an area where they could go too fast or too far in some ways, but having been part of the deliberations before I retired and now reading about the deliberations in the last meeting in March, they're being very careful to think it through and to pace it slowly and get the balance sheet down to probably $1.5 to $2 trillion, something like that. And I think it can be done without it having much of an impact on the economy. Yeah, I mean, if you accept my idea of the neutral rate or the equilibrium rate being about 3%, they'll march toward that as long as the economy is cooperating. So 3% policy rate would mean a 10-year treasury would probably be a couple hundred basis points higher, and more like what you remember back in the middle part of the last decade as interest rate structure. There is a very important reason that the Federal Reserve wants to be able to pursue that policy, and that is to get away from zero. Because if you think about it, if a shock does affect the economy, if there is another recession looming, or we're getting indications of the economy turning down, when you're close to zero, you don't have much firepower. There's not much you can do about it. So it's not an end in itself to get away from zero, but it is extremely useful to have some cushion so that you have something you can do if the economy gets into a bad patch.
I'm wearing my...
What I love about groups of retired people, myself included, is you can stay all afternoon, right? So if this were a Kiwanis meeting, it would have been cut off.
I was going to say, I'm wearing my pediatric tie.
Uh-huh.
Oh, Andy Namias. Oh, sorry. I want to get some of your thoughts about children, their future, their obstetrician problems of today, that you read the paper that Greece and Italy, etc., now are having 1.3 babies, not to replace it, so how are you going to fill in for the later? And the problems that we face with the new technologies that has made it millions and millions and millions of dollars, so that the very low birth weight premature baby, not the Jackie Kennedy baby, that one no problem with 1,200 grams, with 500-600 grams or some, we're keeping them alive and so on at tremendous cost. There's also the problem that we are not doing enough for the bonding of parents, and the problem that has been faced very well by Sweden and other countries. We can give help mothers and fathers in the early years, because we're learning that there are many problems, if that is not taken care of the neuromental disorders that are going to impact on the mother who's going to be taken care of, the older parent and the kid with a mental problem. So I'd like to get an idea of you, from you, since you're the expert, of what you plan to do about changing the economy so that the future of our children, grandchildren, will be preserved and made much better than it is now.
Well, thanks for the softball question.
Well, I told my wife, my Swedish wife, that if you don't touch base with, even mention child during your
Yeah. Let me start with what I buy into as a layman. That can sometimes be dangerous, layman's opinions on things, but I buy into the increasing view that the ages 0 to 2 or 0 to 3 are absolutely crucial in brain formation. And one of my favorite people in Atlanta is a fellow named Comer Yates, who just joined our advisory council at the Brain Health Center. He's the director or the head of the Atlanta Speech School. Some of you, I know Comer. And I love the guy because he is so passionate about childhood literacy and getting children by the age of, by the 3rd grade to read at grade level. But he gives a very compelling speech about the importance of babies literally from a few hours of birth to, throughout their early years, hearing 30,000 words a day and 3 or 4 million words a year, and having parents who engage them in speech to develop, broadly speaking, literacy skills. The Grady Hospital, I understand, has bought off on a program to coach young mothers on, it's called, I think, vocabulary nutrition. So when they come out and the baby's born and they're about to leave, they'll get the normal coaching on how you take care of a baby, but then they'll get a little lecture on talking to your baby and the importance of vocabulary or literary nutrition. And I find it very distressing that some will argue that the die is cast by age 4 or 5. If you're born into an affluent family that's oral and speaks a lot, and you get a lot of nourishment in terms of words, you're able to learn to read, you're able to become self-sufficient, ultimately a self-sufficient human being. And if you are parked in front of a TV, or your single mother is stressed out, and so you don't get a lot of interaction in those early years, the die is cast before you ever get to formal education. That is a view, I think, that is held by some, and that is very distressing. So what kind of world are we creating for young people? Well, we're clearly creating a world where if you are not decently educated, your life is going to be a complete struggle. And if you don't get the foundation, remedial work later in the educational process, may or may not pay off. So I happen to believe we got to start young. I visualize a world in which formal education starts at age 3 or maybe even 2.5. My granddaughter is in a French school where they teach, obviously operate in French, and her mother speaks English, her father speaks Spanish. And they have 3 hours of Arabic a week. And she's in her 2nd year of school in Amman, Jordan, and she's 3 years old. This is structured pre-K education in age-appropriate classrooms with teachers who have been trained for this age group. And if you know anything about the French schools, everywhere in the world on that day, they're doing exactly the same thing at that hour. I mean, it is highly codified what they do. But, she's 3.5 and is in her 2nd year of formal education. And if someone starts at age 5.5 or 6, one more way of sort of visualizing this world is jobs that we would consider to be blue-collar and not requiring a high degree of education are increasingly turning into machine tending jobs as opposed to machine operating jobs. So someone with a pretty average blue-collar factory-type job will have to be able to work with a digital interface device of some kind and have the skills to be able to do that going forward. That will be a manufacturing job. And just in the last week, I've had conversations with people in the paper industry, for example, and some other industries that say, yeah, that's exactly what's happening, is automation is turning those jobs into watching the machines and intervening when there's something wrong, but not operating the machines any longer. So we have big challenges.
So I know it's about time to go. Just one more question. You talked about demographics and the baby boomers retiring, and also the labor force participation rate going down. And it looks like sort of one consequence of that is fewer workers supporting more people who are retired in the economy. So what do you...
What they call the dependency ratio.
So what would your comments be on that for the future?
Well, one way to think about economic growth is number of people working times the hours they work, times the productivity that comes from their skill set. And if all of those things are expanding, you get economic growth. Well, I have argued, is that mine? No. I have argued that we're going to see a declining participation, so that is a drag to growth. That productivity growth is a question mark, and I doubt that Americans are going to work, they already work longer hours in most places in the world, are going to work a lot more hours. So it's just another reason to be cautious about the assumption that the economy, at least in the medium term, is going to grow, really fast, because participation is part of that equation. And I expect that the number of people working will decline and the number of dependent people, meaning retirees, will increase.
Well, so I'm afraid we have to go, but let's all thank Dennis Lockhart for a great lecture.
Before everyone goes, I do want to make a brief thank you to Dennis. He mentioned the brain